All right, the actual layout of this program. It's important to get comfortable with it, but it's also, fortunately, not terribly complicated. There are a few major sections here to be aware of, and once you know that on a basic level, you will be able to figure out where you need to go to look at and adjust certain properties. So, of course, at the very top here, you have your file, edit, view, etc. And you definitely, for these templates and these tutorials, want to make sure under view you have show patch editor selected, because we're going to be doing node stuff, as you know. And now we can see our patch editor here at the bottom center. And this gray center is an infinite canvas, basically. And if you right click here, you have options for nodes. I'm just going to add an animation patch. You see I can left click on it and drag it around. And I'm on a Mac, so I'm going to command and zoom out with my middle mouse button, and you see we get our zoom. And then in the lower left-hand corner of the patch editor, you see a show map. Click that. That brings up a mini map. Makes it very handy for when you need to get around a big complicated node graph. You see how you have that lighter rectangle giving you the viewport that's current for your patch editor. So I can zoom in and out. You see how that's reflected in the mini map. And if I right click, I get my nodes. Left click, I can drag around. If I hold in my middle mouse button, it acts like a grabber for the canvas itself. So it's a way to navigate and pull around the patch editor canvas. And one thing you'll see when node graphs get big and complicated and start to look a little bit like spaghetti is that organizationally sometimes it's preferable to group things together in their own little contained space, which is a subgraph. And you can do that by selecting everything. I just did a click, left drag, select, just a box select. Right click, group. Okay, so now this group can be expanded. You can rename that whatever you like, and you can click this upper right hand arrow, and that expands it out. It expands it into nothing. Not really. If you show map, you'll see in your mini map, this is a part of the value of the mini map, but also one of the little quirks of meta is that you just don't know where it's going to plop you out sometimes. We click there on the mini map and it scrolls us over. So you see we're just kind of a level deep from where we were, but the patches are the same and everything else is otherwise unchanged. And we could go back from the group to main. I'm going to right click on it, and I can ungroup, and there we're back to normal. So you'll see when you look at the templates especially that there's going to be grouped up stuff just to try to make things visually a little less crazy. In the upper left hand corner here we have our scene panel, and it displays a hierarchical view of all the objects that are actually like in the project. You can see through the main viewport here, and in the emulator, which is here, this is designed to emulate as though you were using your smartphone, and you see we have a kind of an untextured checkerboard rectangle here. So we have our device, which is our smartphone, the camera of that, the focal distance from that camera. These are all default things that will be there in a new project. And I've added a canvas element and a rectangle there just to show a little bit about the viewport and the emulator here. But everything that you're going to use in your project that you want to be seen and interacted with, you'll see that you will bring in or see that brought in to this structure here and reflected here respectively. And to add things to this scene hierarchy, you can either come down here to this lower right hand plus sign, which will bring up options of things you can add. I can just throw a plane in here, for example, insert, and it just adds it. And you see that reflected in the viewport and in the emulator. You can also drag things up. Like this 3D object I have in assets, I could drag another instance of it somewhere into my focal distance. And the original size of that 3D object was very big, so now you see there's this huge thing blocking everything. I'll just right click on that and delete it, get it back out of there. But that's how you can get stuff into the hierarchy. You can use that plus sign. You can bring things in from your assets panel. We'll talk more about assets in just a second. Next to the scene is layers. Layers controls the render order of the objects that you have in your scene, which for some of your projects just is not going to be important, honestly. Like you may never need to use layers depending on where you have things organized in your scene layout, but they can be very useful, and you can also get into some trouble get into some problems that you don't realize are because your render order is weird because you have a few layers here, one stacked on top of each other, and it's doing weird things to your render. When we talk about troubleshooting, we'll talk more about that. But everything will be here in the scene panel that you're going to have live here. So right next to the scene panel, and as you saw, we have our big viewport in the center. And if we right click, we can kind of pivot around. And if we push in on our middle mouse, we can truck or strafe around instead of pivoting. And you can select elements, so you can left mouse click on elements here. In this case, I have a rectangle, and I've clicked on it, and you see it's got a blue bounding box now with these squares that indicate that you can click and hold on them to toggle the scaling of it by default. Up here at the top, we have a few options for controlling whether we're going to be rotating or scaling or just moving elements that we want to see. And by default, it'll be set to position, so just clicking and moving. If I have my rectangle, and I left click in here, I can move around, click off the rectangle, and I'll click on this 3D object here, just called transformer. By default here, we see it has XYZ axis arrows. So I can, in my viewport, middle mouse, zoom in and out, grab left mouse click a arrow. In this case, I grabbed the Y, X, and then Z. Bring it closer, farther from you. And then you see I changed over to the scale. So it changes from arrows to these little rectangles at the end instead. Just a little visual tell that if I start messing with this, I'm telling Spark to mess with the scale of the 3D object. And you see that also reflects in the emulator to the side here. The emulator is, as the name would suggest, emulating a smartphone. This is what it should look like going through a user's smartphone if they're doing a selfie. And sometimes that's accurate and sometimes it's not. Left here, scene panel, middle viewport, right emulator. The emulator is very useful, and if you go to the lower left-hand corner of the emulator, you'll see you have an option of other videos you can use, which is especially helpful if you don't want to spend a lot of time sending stuff to your phone for local testing, and you want to see certain triggers that might be relevant to the effect that you're making, like turning the head, nodding up and down, getting a full body for segmentation, whatever. You can also rotate if you want something that looks different or want to see how something would look in landscape. And when you click in the emulator, by default, that left click is going to punch through and affect the viewport behind the emulator, as you can see here. But if you hold down Command on a Mac, you'll see that changes the cursor, and that will simulate a screen tap. So if you have interaction set up there, that's how you would test it with the emulator. And that brings us to the right here, which is our inspector panel. And with our rectangle selected, we see we have all of its properties. Its scaling properties, and you see where we messed with the width here. Height, position. By default, when you create a canvas element, which is just kind of a holder that doesn't have structure of its own, it will place elements in the upper left-hand corner, but you can adjust where you pivot around your elements by clicking on these. And if you click off of all of them, it will be centered. And interesting to note here are the right arrows that can be highlighted when you hover over them in the inspector panel. This means if you click it, it will generate a patch or a node here in the patch editor. And this is one of the ways in which you can start to interact with various aspects of the elements that you want to play with in your effect. And by default, some of the stuff you probably won't change. And you may not need to use. I'll be honest, I've never used tags because I've never felt the need to, but you very well could. And what we might also notice here is that this rectangle is just a checkerboard pattern. That's a default pattern. I didn't make that. That's what's going to happen when you first add a rectangle to a canvas element. It needs to have a material added to it, and you can do that here. And this brings us over to the lower left-hand section, which is our assets, materials, textures section. So this is the bin, the storage area, where you're going to keep all of your stuff, like your images that you've made, you want to drag in. You can drag them into here or choose from computer by going to this plus sign at the lower right-hand corner. You see you have a few options here of native things that you can build or add to the project. but you can also import up here from computer texture animation, which does not have to be like a pre-made sprite sheet. It can just be a selection of images. So you could go into a folder and multi-select a bunch of images, and it will pull it in as a singular animation. It's a very handy way to do it. And this is also where you could pull in like a color lookup table, LUT, if you wanted to add a special kind of stylized color filter to your effect. There are other ways to do it. You don't have to use a LUT, but that is one way people can do it. And materials here, as I was mentioning before, are a set of properties that you add to a texture and then add to an element in your scene structure here. So this rectangle, I've given this default material. This default material, I go into texture and choose this hairball that I have. And now that material has that texture bound to it, but now that also has all these other properties on the material you can use to affect the appearance of that texture. And that is then applied to that rectangle. So there's sort of this multi-step process of getting things looking just how you want. It also lets you configure things just how you want and play and be creative. So now I have this basic material on the rectangle with a hairball. And if I was comfortable with the hairball as it looks, then I'm all done. I've got that on the rectangle now and we're good to go. But maybe I want to color this hairball and I didn't do it in my graphics editing program. Well, I could go to the material, click specular, and I'll change this type to color. And then, yeah, here we've got kind of a purpley color and it applies it to that texture. So you're giving yourself this extra set of options to work with textures. In a more advanced kind of troubleshooting step, but also a construction step, is you could go down to advanced render options in the material. And this use depth test, right to depth test, they start to come in when you start to really layer things or have like facial effects and 3D objects. And you can start to kind of get around where your things are stacked in your scene hierarchy and stuff like that, depending on whether these are checked or not checked. I would say if you're just starting out or using these templates that I've made, that you don't really need to mess with this area. But feel free to. The best way to learn some of this stuff is to break it. And you've got the base templates available, so you can totally trash a project and maybe haven't lost anything. Right below advanced render options, we have used by, and this is useful when you start to really have lots of elements in your project, because this dropdown, as the name suggests, will just show you what elements in your scene hierarchy have these materials applied to them. And going way up back to the top is shader type. Generally, with these templates and stuff, you're not going to need to mess with it, but you have the option to. And the difference between some of these is like flat will not be interacted with the lights in your project. So you can set up lights and angle them and give them color and emission and stuff like that. But a flat shader type will not receive those lights. The standard, which is what you get by default, will. Physically based gives, you see if I choose that, gives you different options. It's really good for getting you like that real material kind of feel. It's really good for metal, as you can see metallic as a surface parameter here. You can make some nice stuff there. And face paint is, as the name suggests, it's specific to textures that you're telling Spark you know are going to be applied to the face. It doesn't have to be applied to the face, but it tells Spark it's going to render it a certain way. And there's more advanced stuff there under shader asset. With these templates, you're not going to have to touch any of that. And then back over here to the lower right-hand corner of the assets panel, I wanted to show you the Search AR library and that plus sign again. And that's where you can incorporate community assets. There's just scores of free things you can import in here that can make life easier, especially in the world of node-based stuff. These patch assets are super useful, and you'll see in one or two of the templates I've made, I make use of them, and why not? They work, and they save you some time for sure. Finally, on this far left side, this little strip, vertical strip going up, we have what are essentially shortcuts or other ways of getting to the same functionality in your project. So at the very top, we have workspace. There's another place you can hide or show the patch editor. Console if you're scripting. The asset summary, which is good if you're trying to figure out how much size things are taking up. Very important in Spark and in TikTok. They both have pretty serious size limits on their effects. It forces some creativity. Showing the asset summary will give you a way to troubleshoot what maybe needs to be optimized. And the multi-peer debugging, which is good for if you are making an effect that's designed to be used like on a video call. You have a few options there. Here we have video, and that is another shortcut to what you already see on the emulator and we went over. We have play, and play refers to what you're seeing in the viewport and the emulator. Is that video playing? Is that effect actually running its script? Play and pause. You could advance just frame by frame if you need to get that kind of granular. You can stop the effect. You can restart the effect. You can do a general search that shows up at the lower middle of the patch editor console editor windows. That'll let you search for any assets that are in your project. And then down here we have the AR library, which is a shortcut to get into that same area I just showed you with the plus sign. We have the test on device. So you need to get the mobile Metaspark player, and you can get that from the App Store and the Google Play Store. And when you have this loaded on your phone and you put your USB cable in, Spark will recognize your phone and be able to pipe the project as it is to your phone, and that way you can test it on a real device and not just lean on the emulator, which is important. I have found so many times that the emulator and the local tester on your phone and what you end up exporting and loading onto the platform itself can all be a little bit different. So it's a bit of a QA process, but that's how you get to it there. You see there's also some shortcuts to do it for if your account's already logged in, you can send it from here to test. I don't use the built-in processes they have for sending stuff to QA or for testing. I tend to do things manually, which I'll show you in the time to publish section. And then in the publish section, which is the button right below that, you publish a new effect, update existing effect, pretty self-explanatory. I do not use either of these. Demo video, I do not use this area. You totally can. These work fine. I am more manual in how I do things because when I make effects, almost always am needing to do so for a client, and it can be much easier to just export the file, which you have here in the lower left-hand corner, and then upload that file manually to the platform. And I go over that in the time to publish section. But here we have view file sizes. This is very important. You want that green check for both. And if you're not getting the green check for both, you probably need to do something to rectify it. And it will tell you if you choose view file sizes, for example, what you need to look at here. View asset summary. Very handy because the original sizes that you're bringing in will get compressed by default and will give you a different total size in terms of what Spark is looking for when it comes to its size ceiling. When you first start a blank project, you might see a yellow or orange mark at the bottom of the gear here. Also in Publish, you might see under Platform Requirements, it will say Choose an Experience Type. It just needs to know if this is something that's going to be used kind of in a typical selfie way, or what is it going to be. So if you click that, it will bring up Experiences, and then you can add the type of effect it's going to be. Sharing effect is the normal kind of thing, but you might be making an ad, or you might be making a video calling effect, which is where that multi-peer that you saw earlier comes into play. I'll just choose sharing effect. And then by default, Instagram and Facebook will both be checked. And if you're doing something that adds an effect that wouldn't be supported by one platform, you'll see a notice about that here. And you might need to pivot and get rid of that particular way that you're doing that effect, or it might not be true in the sense that the majority of people using the effect it might work fine for them, which I've found to be true. I've often gotten warnings about things like segmentation and whatnot, and I've never gotten a kickback in the wild from it not working on both platforms. So something to be aware of. You'll hear me talk about this in other videos, but Spark and TikTok are constantly changing platforms. They are not these static environments that you just have to learn and then you figured it out. They will update their software, and when you update it, it might fix some bugs and introduce others, and you just have to try to stay on top of it if you're really doing this stuff a lot and pivot accordingly. So I've certainly had to refactor whole effects because of this, and that's just sort of the world we're living in. This is not a gold record shipped product. It is a constantly evolving dynamic platform. And lastly, as far as what I think is good for you to know, and you just saw it a second ago, if you do the gear at the far bottom left, you have your change project properties, so you can change your experiences. The capabilities section will get added automatically for you when you add certain kinds of objects, and like facial tracking and stuff to your scene hierarchy, this will automatically happen here. Compression, if it becomes important, I think it's a good idea and good practice to optimize your assets before you even bring them in. So you mess with the settings in Spark as little as possible. And that's a little bit battle weariness on my end. And licenses I've never had to touch, quite frankly. So that, in a nutshell, are the major sections of Spark and kind of what each is responsible for and what each does. And I really recommend just playing around with stuff and breaking it. I am a troubleshooter by nature. I did not start my profession by doing a deep academic dive. I just got thrown into things and had to figure it out. So my perspective is one of just keep a clean copy of whatever else and get a copy where you dive in with an unfamiliar environment and just start messing with stuff, and you will learn very quickly what's going to work and what's not. But you'll also hear me talk in different ways about bits and pieces of that in the templates section, also in troubleshooting and time to publish and all that. So let's take a pause here, and I'll see you in the next video.